Hello and welcome to Economic Security Watch, the podcast that takes you direct to the individuals and stories shaping the new investment landscape. I'm Danielle Miles. Before we begin, I want to remind you that in addition to our podcast, we have a monthly newsletter dedicated to the most important economic security developments worldwide. For details on how to subscribe, see fdiintelligence.com or the show notes on your podcast platform. Our guest in this episode is someone who has been at the forefront of geopolitics' impact on business for decades. Tina Fordham was the first Chief Global Political Analyst at a global investment bank, that being Citi, which is a world that she entered in 2003. Nowadays, as the founder of Fordham Global Foresight, she advises C-suites on the risks and opportunities presented by the new global order. Tina has helped steer the corporate and financial world through some of the most defining events and crises of this century. But she says that some of the issues facing businesses today are like never before, and that their leaders must start looking at geopolitics through a new lens. Tina, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So we are at the mid-year point of 2026. What are the biggest takeaways or events that we've seen to date? And what is the outlook going forward? Which are the signposts that we should be looking for in the geopolitical world?
Well, I think it's always a wise idea to take stock and actually to do a little bit of reflection, even though, of course, we're all about being forward-looking when we're working in markets and in business. And 2026, really started with a bang.
And today, in a stunning act of regime change, the U.S. military captured and brought Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro to U.S. soil. Not long after that, in a remarkable declaration, President Trump announced the U.S. would, quote, run Venezuela and warned of a new era of United States domination over Latin America.
And that was followed immediately by President Trump talking about annexing Greenland.
We need Greenland from a national security situation. It's so strategic. Right now, Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships all over the place. We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security. And Denmark is not going to be able to do it, I can tell you.
A bit of political rhetoric that didn't move markets, but I would argue actually had a significant effect on the policy debate in Europe, and also on one of the biggest investment themes for the last year, which is the European rearmament trade. The Greenland, rhetoric, threats, offer to buy, whatever we want to call it, really did focus minds here in Europe about relations with the United States. And then, of course, the war in Iran, which market participants thought would be over quickly. I advised from the beginning that it was likely to carry on longer for all kinds of reasons. And here we are at mid-year in the wake of these geopolitical developments, from a U.S. president who has a longstanding, policy of not getting involved in foreign wars, or talking about not getting involved in foreign entanglements. And it really feels like it's geopolitics all the time. Looking into what happens next, we've got a second half of the year where U.S. midterms in November will give everybody a bit of a glimpse into what the U.S. population is thinking about American policy and the state of the U.S. economy with the impact of the Iran war. And normally, in normal times, U.S. midterms would be a domestic issue. They wouldn't be watched very closely. But with a U.S. president who is committed to changing the U.S. traditional role in the world, particularly as a guarantor of free trade and security, and we're seeing that with the Strait of Hormuz and talk of U.S. troop drawdowns in NATO bases in Europe. With all of this in mind, those U.S. midterms start to become really important for investors and observers as a gauge of what happens next.
As you said, it seems to be geopolitics all the time, and obviously the examples that you've listed are testament to that. You've also said that since last year, we've entered a geopolitical supercycle. Can you explain this concept? What does it mean, and why is it happening now?
Well, our geopolitics supercycle framework is based on empirical research that we conducted that looked at the period between 2010, the tail end of the global financial crisis, through the end of 2024. So a 15-year period. We actually constructed a database, and this is always a challenge when you're looking at geopolitics. We have always a measurement issue. And during that period, what we found was that geopolitical shock events tripled. In other words, in the period before Trump 2.0. And so the geopolitics supercycle took off quite a long time ago, arguably in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. And it has gained momentum as we enter the second year now of President Trump's second term, where again, he's committed to changing the US traditional role in the global system, or at least in post-war terms. And that means perceptions about the period of peak globalization and the Pax Americana, which most of us have grown up in, so much so that many people don't know what it refers to. And that's quite profound. So the geopolitics supercycle has documented, for the purposes of answering the question that I tend to be asked most often in boardrooms, and that is, when are we going back to normal? And the short answer is we haven't been in normal for quite a long time. And this isn't all because of President Trump. The uptick in geopolitical risks and shocks, using the framework that we've devised, looks at how the drivers of geopolitical risk have increased. And that's things like climate change disruption, declines in public trust, corruption perceptions, these kinds of things, at the same time as the global guardrails that have been buffers, kind of mitigating the impact of geopolitical risks, have started to erode. And that's rule of law, diplomacy, international institutions, and even central banks and their kind of reaction function. So stronger drivers, weaker guardrails, more risk events. That's our framework, and we have a database that that backs it up and tracks those shocks.
See, and you're among many experts that obviously say we've passed this period of peak globalization for some of the reasons that you sort of outlined. But what comes next? What does the next era of sort of trade and investment patterns look like in your perspective?
Well, the change in the U.S. role arguably leaves a power vacuum. But the way that I describe it is an interregnum in the global operating system. Interregnum means the period between kings, in fact. But what we find ourselves in is a gap, if you like, between a period when we knew what the rules of the game were in business, roughly. We knew how to think about elections and policy changes and regulatory changes and adjust for those. But we don't have a playbook for a time when competition is the main driver, and that competition, especially for resources, as well as for other types of commodities, and looking again at the war in Iran, where we've got economic choke points being monetized, and it won't be the last case where this happens. It's a bit of a free for all, and that's a huge challenge for board leaders and for C-suite leaders who've been able to operate with a presumption of continuity in the plumbing, if you like, of the global system for all of their professional careers. I mean, really going back to at least the 1970s. I think that the challenge really is that, first of all, unless you believe in predestination, it's not possible to predict what the next sort of paradigm is. And secondly, of course, people have agency and can help influence and determine that. But I would say that corporate leaders aren't used to thinking that way. They're used to waiting for the kind of dictates from the state to emerge. We're going to be in a mushy period of heightened uncertainty for quite a while, and it gives space both for unexpected events, to have perhaps outsized impact, and maybe for rogue actors or new actors to make a splash.
So in this sort of post-unipolar world, which you've obviously just explained, yes, there is a power vacuum. We see the US retreating from its traditional role. But I guess obviously the sort of rise of China and the tensions and competition between the two of them are sort of a key factor, a key defining moment, I guess. And obviously there's much talk about a China-US decoupling and the extent to which that could happen or is even feasible for it to happen. But in terms of this idea of companies and even governments having to align more with China or the US, given their current foreign policy making, what are you telling boards about how to navigate this period? To what extent do they have to choose?
Well, I mean, I think that companies, but also kind of all the other countries in the world that aren't global superpowers, meaning China, the United States, and Russia would like to be considered a global superpower, find themselves in this uncomfortable position. First of all, of efforts particularly by China and the US to force them to take sides, when, of course, what middle powers in particular want, and this is the term that Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney uses a lot, is to, of course, follow their own national interests. But the trends I think, are less sort of less crass, if you like, than aligning with either the US or China, and more what we hear more about in boardrooms and in investment terms is reducing dependencies. This used to be applied to the China case, but now it's increasingly applied to the US case. Americans struggle with this idea, and I often share some public opinion data to highlight this point. We started out talking about the Greenland developments and, of course, the war in Iran. What you can see is that global public opinion has reached, what I called an inflection point earlier this year, whereby in many countries, including here in the UK and several historic US allies in Europe and elsewhere, China is more trusted than the United States. This hasn't happened before. Now, does that translate into flows, into changes in FDI? Well, that's a lagging indicator. There's some evidence to suggest that it is. I don't expect that to be a kind of a flood in change, but countries are recalibrating their dependencies upon the United States. And so that means, for example, the UK has worked with Ukraine to develop some military kit that involves no US components. That would not have been a priority even a year ago. And this is the kind of change in perception and orientation that really surprises Americans, my fellow Americans, because I don't think there's sufficient appreciation of how the uncertainty sparked by US policy is causing reactions elsewhere in the world. And one of the ways that challenges traditional business orthodoxy is this optimization versus resilience argument. Optimization has been, the holy grail, of course, resulting in very complex supply chains, and building resilience, which is a term, that has been referenced increasingly in company documents, is increasingly a value, but it's more expensive.
You've spoken obviously about some of the uncertainty created overseas by US policymaking, and sort of some of the examples of that include this idea of the US government sort of weaponizing, I guess, traditional economic tools, tariffs, obviously, but also export controls potentially. Even investment screening has been politicized a little. There are allegations of it being politicized in the US, even before Trump returned to office. China also, there are examples of them doing this, obviously export controls in relation to rare earths. But to what extent is this going to be, or do you think, is it going to be a permanent feature of international commerce? Is this something that multinationals need to get used to the idea of governments, be it China, the US, or others, sort of using these traditional economic tools sort of for potentially political gains?
I think it's absolutely gloves off now when it comes to superpower competition, particularly over commodities and natural resources. You have to imagine what the countervailing force would be to push back against that. And there isn't a constituency that is, willing to take on the United States and its pursuit of dominance in AI, for example. It's rolled back, barriers and obstacles to things like data centers and expansion. But there is one potential source of pushback that I talk about in my forthcoming book, which is based on an earlier conceptual framework and research that I conducted on what I called Vox Populi risk. Vox Populi meaning voice of the people. And, guess what? There is only um, one topic with genuine bipartisan opposition in the United States right now, for example, and it's opposition to data centers and anxiety about AI. And this is where, there's the potential kind of a feedback loop between the geopolitics and that supercycle environment that says weaponize everything in pursuit of expanding state power, particularly when it comes to these natural resources, and rolling back perhaps some of those protections for consumers, for working people that might just generate real blowback at the polls. Hence the Vox Populi risk angle.
You've just touched on my next question, which was going to be, we've spoken a lot about government instigated changes, but what about changes from the bottom up that boards need to be aware of during this super cycle? So sort of, yes, civil unrest, populism, or perhaps moving the other way, demographic changes. To what extent should these perhaps more natural causes of geopolitical issues or risks be front of mind for corporate leaders?
It's a major research interest of mine, something that I've been tracking for a long time. And I talk about it with board leaders in terms of rising insecurity, because I think that that's a helpful kind of a umbrella concept, if you like. It's insecurity over what happens with jobs. It's intergenerational tensions over the social contract. Will younger people be able to have, pensions and buy a home? And this kind of generalized anxiety and uncertainty is kind of there for mobilizing. It can be mobilized by populist leaders who often offer, simple kinds of answers to complex problems. One of the things we see, though, is that often when populist leaders are elected, they don't end up being able to deliver. We see the kind of cycle of leaders like we're experiencing here in the UK, where the prime minister has resigned, and this is the sixth prime minister in 10 years. The quip is that the UK is becoming like Italy politically, but without the food and the weather. And this feeds into the idea that, voters are not happy. The political center has shrunk. I don't think that business leaders understand that, though, because, most of us being forged in this era of peak globalization are fairly centrist in our own orientation, right? Economically, liberal in the European term, use of the term, and perhaps fiscal conservatives, socially pretty liberal. That's not what populations look like at the moment. And so the chances that business gets the kind of political center, pro-business government that they're used to is starting to shrink. And so I'm looking already at the European election cycle next year, for example, as well as US midterms. There's a great deal of churn, anxiety, dissatisfaction, and what we know is one of the most important drivers in public opinion, and that's low trust in all elites, not just government, but also business, media, and in some countries of each other.
For all the reasons that you've been talking about, this idea of a new C-suite position, a geopolitical geopolitical officer or geopolitics officer is sort of sparking debate. And there are some examples that we've heard of multinationals having a similar role to this. But you say that a better alternative is to lift the political quotient of corporate leaders, I presume, to make sort of geopolitics a more inherent part of decision making across the board. Can you just explain this theory? Why is this a better approach?
Well, I feel very strongly about it, and the real world experience with it is, first of all, I was the chief global political analyst at a large investment bank, and I've observed how challenging it can be to operationalize this kind of content, and how it is also just a footnote in most cases to business decision making. And so I think if you bring in a retired general or an ambassador and give them a C-suite role, and they're sitting in executive committees without having real world private sector experience, that person isn't going to be used well. And there is a phenomenon, that I liken to being from different tribes. You speak different languages if you are a government leader or a military leader versus a business leader. And this is why I think it makes much more sense for senior executives and their teams to get to grips with the fundamentals of what I call PQ. We were all told for the last decade or so we needed to become better at our EQ, our emotional quotient. I think it's going to be time for a crash course, not in, reading the news all the time, but understanding that what's happening in the world is really about power. And that has a direct impact, often to the benefit of companies that get this, in terms of a wave of M&A and consolidation, regional, companies or entities that may be, in a prime position to benefit. But it means adding geopolitics to the lens that a company thinks through, rather than subcontracting this to one specialist whose expertise is just likely to be marginalized, in my view.
We are on the Economic Security Watch podcast, and this idea of economic security is something that more traditionally open countries have governments which are leaning towards adopting this philosophy. But it's no secret that there's no strict definition of this emerging concept. What does it mean to you?
We're in an era of the weaponization and the monetization of everything. Maybe it was an inevitable consequence of the times that we're living in, but the notion of monetizing choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, which was open and not monetized before the war in Iran, my view and how I've advised our clients is that Iran is going to continue to collect fees on this indefinitely. It's found a new revenue source. I think, though, when it comes to this notion of rule of law, rules of the game, and regulation, that's where things, really do get complicated for companies, because that optimization framework, the just-in-time, the frictionless world, that's what we're losing. And that's a difficult practical adjustment as well as mental adjustment. It means friendshoring, of course, which has been talked about for years, but also, a return to regional hubs. And this just goes counter to what most of us have been trained for and been expecting.
Tina, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Economic Security Watch is a podcast by FDI Intelligence. For details on how to subscribe to it and our monthly newsletter, please see the show notes on your podcast platform, YouTube, or on fdiintelligence.com. And as always, please get in touch with your feedback and ideas at danielle.miles@ft.com.